This election is a choice between Labor's plan to keep building or Peter Dutton's promise to cut. That is the choice.
I don't believe that we can simply afford to continue down the current path, and that means that we can't afford 3 more years of Labor.
What is at stake? Who should we be keeping an eye on? And what's likely to happen? It's time to ask all of these questions because, believe it or not, we're already approaching the end of week 1 of Australia's 36-day federal election campaign to decide who will lead the nation for the next 3 years. Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones and welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. Last week, the countdown officially began for what's looking like a knife-edge federal election on May the 3rd. If you flick on the tally, you'll be blasted with political ads. Take your dog for a walk, you're going to pass by dozens of campaign posters, hopefully ones that haven't been defaced or nicked.
So, hang on mate, what are you doing?
I'm taking the sign down.
Yeah, beg your pardon?
I'm taking the sign down.
Nobody can tell me how this is all going to play out. The only thing I do know is that we're going to be chomping on our democracy sausages before we know it. So let's cut through the noise and lay out exactly what the top things Australians and those invested here need to know. Ben Westcott is Bloomberg's man in the Canberra Press Gallery and he joins me today. G'day, Ben. Great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back, Beck.
Now, this will be the second election campaign you've reported on for Bloomberg News here in Australia. What's the vibe like in Canberra and how is that different to 2022?
Look, there were two real differences between this election and the last one. The first one is that the last election was really seen from the offset as a change election. The Liberal National Coalition government, our centre-right party, was 9 years old, and it's always a big ask to go for a fourth term in power. So there was a feeling that even though it was not something that could be taken for granted, that it was probably a change election. The other thing, however, was that the ghost of the 2019 election really hung over the whole proceedings. That was an election similar to the 2016 vote in the US, where Australians had expected a Labor win, expected the then 6-year-old coalition government to be taken out of power, and then in a shock turn of events on election day, Morrison won his miracle election win. So there was always this feeling around 2022 that you couldn't necessarily trust the polls, you couldn't necessarily read the voters, and anything was possible. This time around, 3 years later, after Albanese won, there is a feeling more that you can trust the polls and that people are more confident that we're probably going to see a second term for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. But as you said, it's a knife-edge vote, and if the polls keep trending in Albanese's direction, people will, in the Labor campaign, will be relaxing more. But we'll have to see. It's a long 5-week election campaign for Australians to sit through.
We already know a lot about the two main contenders in this race, don't we? They've been everywhere in recent weeks leading up to last Friday's election date announcement. Ben, can you run us through the key big policies that Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton will be going head-to-head on?
It's funny because the 2022 election at the time was very criticised for a lack of big ideas, but looking back at it now, it almost seems like a huge issue election. Back then, people were talking about climate change a lot. We were talking about Indigenous rights and a huge range of topics. Now, this election is really about cost of living. It's about, after 3 years of high inflation, high interest rates, high energy prices, which party can do the most for Australians to help them in their hip pocket. That's why, one of the biggest differences already that's emerged is between Anthony Albanese's government, who's promising a small tax cut in the coming 3 years if they're re-elected, and Peter Dutton's opposition that is promising to remove that tax cut and instead cut the fuel excise. There's other forms of dispute between the two. Peter Dutton has said he'll put in place a gas reserve policy if he comes to power, saving, in his words, more Australian gas for Australians. And Anthony Albanese has promised lots more money for healthcare, including about $9 billion for Medicare to improve the number of free health appointments for Australians. So those are sort of the lines we're seeing at this stage slowly developing over the course of the campaign.
So, Ben, those are some really key points of debates that we can expect to see come out in the coming weeks. Let's pause for a second here and take a listen to the ABC's Anthony Green on the state of Parliament as we head into this election campaign period.
The Labor goes into the election with 78 seats, the Coalition 57. There's one or two members left, but 57 is their starting point, and there's 15 on the crossbench. The swings that are needed, the Labor Party, a swing of about 1% would probably deprive it of its majority. A swing of about 3.5% might allow the Coalition to end up with more seats than Labor. But the swing for the Coalition to reach majority government is beyond 5%. So it's quite a substantial effort for them to get into government.
So given what we heard there, Ben, what are the most likely outcomes that we're looking at for the evening of May 3rd, or indeed in the following days if there isn't a clear result? Could Australia have a minority government?
I think there's a very strong likelihood of that, just given the fact that both parties are seeing their primary vote, that's people who are voting for them first, very, very low compared to historic results. If we look back to, elections in the 70s and the 80s, Labor and the Liberal Party would see their votes in the 40% easy, sometimes as high as 50%. Now they're both scrounging around 33, 37%. And that's why at the last election we saw a record third of all votes go to parties who are not one of the two major parties. And I think that is a clear indication of a trend in Australian politics. There's no doubt that out of the last 5 elections, 4 have been decided by just a handful of seats, just in either direction. And there's no reason to think that this one will not be exactly the same. Now, what does that mean for Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese? It means that probably after election night, they're going to have to approach someone on the crossbench. It's a very broad crossbench at this stage, but they'll have to approach some minor parties or independent lawmakers to get their support to form government.
And who are these actors? Who could be the kingmakers, if you like, if things are really tight?
Well, one thing that is to both of the Prime Minister and the opposition leader's advantage is that they have such a broad crossbench at this stage that if they need to find support, there's a lot of options for them. So that goes from everything from on the left, we have the minor party, the Greens, who have got currently 4 lawmakers, and at least one will still be in the House after the election. They then go into the Teal Independents, who are more centrist lawmakers who focus on climate action and political integrity. There is a large number of them before we move to more populist independents, and then finally right-wing lawmakers like Bob Katter from Queensland, who I'm sure would leap at the chance to support a Peter Dutton government. So they both have a wide range of potential options for their minority governments should they fall just a few seats short of that majority.
So you're saying it could come from anywhere, right? It could come from the Greens, could come from one of the independents on both sides, all the way to Bob Katter.
All we know is that Albanese will not be forming any coalitions. He was a member of the Gillard minority government in 2010. He was the manager of the House back then, and he knows the poisonous way in which the Labor Greens formal pact was used against both parties at the in the following 3 years and in the election after that. So he will not be signing any formal agreements. That doesn't mean he won't bet on the Green support to pass laws in the lower house, particularly since Peter Dutton has said he will not be going to the Greens, and the Greens have said they'll not be going to Peter Dutton.
Speaking of Greens, you mentioned gas earlier, and that's one of the big points of difference between the parties at this stage. Can you talk me through Peter Dutton's plan there? It's really upset the industry with the fact that, it's going to affect existing projects, right?
Yes. So Peter Dutton has said that if he wins the election, then he'll put in place a gas reserve policy on the East Coast. There's already one in place on the West Coast, but there never has been one on the East Coast, and that's the heavily populated part of Australia with Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. Now, under this policy, it would mean that producers would have to put aside a certain amount of their gas for domestic consumption. Peter Dutton has spoken about 50 to 100 petajoules, or about 10 to 20% of the total gas needed by Australian consumers. Now, in compared to Australia's gas exports, that's an absolutely tiny amount. We export over 1,000 petajoules, but it will still make a mark, particularly for manufacturers and for companies on Australia's east coast, and of course consumers. Now, for Labor, they say that they've already convinced the gas companies to put aside at least this amount of gas in past years and in coming years, and therefore there's no need for a gas reserve. They also point to the domestic gas trigger they have embedded in the laws, which means that if there is a shortfall, they can demand that gas companies will make up that shortfall from their exported gas. But it's not the same thing as a reserve. The final thing I would also say is that we've already seen some response from Korea, which has reacted somewhat negatively to the proposal, given that Japan and South Korea are so dependent on Australia's natural gas for their own industries.
Is it going to be enough to have these voters that, the big business, the gas companies, to switch their vote? They don't like this plan of Peter Dutton's.
I think that there is a real risk for Peter Dutton that if he doesn't put out some very serious modelling on how much this will reduce energy prices and how much this will save consumers, they will just see instead the Labor Party's tax plan, which says very clearly how much money they'll save, and think that is a more appealing quantity. Now, there's a reason why the coalition is reluctant to put out their modelling of exactly how much it will save, because at the last election, Anthony Albanese promised a $275 cut to power bills, and that never eventuated, partly through international factors, partly through the verities of domestic demand. So they're reluctant to hang their own flag on the same post that Anthony Albanese was somewhat thwarted by. Nonetheless, I think if there is not more clear numbers for Australian voters, they might not be too enthralled by this policy.
Now, Ben, you mentioned the cost of living crisis before, and we know that the Reserve Bank of Australia has started to cut rates, which has no doubt helped Labor's popularity a bit. How is the debate on interest rates and inflation likely to play out in the campaign?
Well, if it stays as it currently is, then it will probably be a net benefit to the Prime Minister. As you said, we've started to see interest rates come down. We've started to see inflation come down as well. And he talks a lot about how it's now half what it was when they came to office. And there's no doubt that the last monthly figures were inside the Reserve Bank's target band. That being said, there will be one very important read of inflation in the week before the election, I believe on the 30th of April. On that day, if inflation moves in the wrong direction, that will be used as a stick by Peter Dutton to batter Anthony Albanese all the way to the poll on Saturday. And it could be a real, fifth week surprise if it is a nasty turn on inflation. That being said, a result in the opposite direction, one that was weaker than expected and promised more cuts immediately after the election with a Reserve Bank meeting in May, that would be a real wind at Albanese's back as he heads, in his words, into the fourth quarter.
It's quite a delicate game, isn't it? And when we come back, we discuss the elephant in the room. What does Trump and his tariff mayhem mean for the election? And what are our biggest companies hoping will happen? This is the Bloomberg Australia podcast. Welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're here with me, Rebecca Jones, and I'm talking to Ben Westcott, Bloomberg's Canberra-based government reporter. Ben, Donald Trump and his tariffs are making our mornings pretty chaotic in the Bloomberg bureaus these days. I imagine they aren't a huge amount of fun for Anthony Albanese either. Who is seen as best, I guess, given their track records, to handle Trump with all of his demands and day-to-day pronouncements that are causing all of this global volatility?
Well, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull put it very well this week when he said at the National Press Club that both Albanese and Dutton have got their own strengths and their own weaknesses when it comes to dealing with Trump. So to start with Dutton, he has a very good ideological links to Trump. One of his biggest supporters is Australian billionaire Gina Rinehart, who is another big supporter of Trump's and was actually at Mar-a-Lago on election night. So there's instantly a sense of rapport between the two leaders. The downside, however, is that ideologically, Dutton's base will also be quite sympathetic to Trump, which will mean that if Dutton needs to push back, it could be harder for him politically. Then already we're starting to see that over the course of the campaign, that Dutton has to somehow distance himself from Trump, given the fact that the US president is not terribly popular in Australia, while at the same time keeping his ideological base on side. On the other hand, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is not an ideological bedfellow of Donald Trump, and that could leave him instantly at a disadvantage. However, he has no reason not to be tough on Trump, other than the fact that he has to balance Australia's national interest. His base would probably prefer him to be a lot tougher on the US president. And already we've seen some strong results from Albanese. Now, although we didn't get the exemption on aluminum and steel tariffs, Trump described Albanese as a very fine man after just 2 phone calls, something which I think not very many people had really been expecting. And I think whoever wins the election will still face an uphill battle to take on Trump, given the current disruptions in the US.
So, Ben, we've talked so far about the key policy positions that we know about on both sides, how interest rates and the cost of living are also key influences, and how both Dutton and Albanese may differ in ways to handle whatever's next to come out of the White House. But Ben, this is a Bloomberg podcast, so we do need to talk about one other really important group here, and that's big business. Who will Australian corporates be hoping to see in power after all this is done? What are the people you've been talking to for your reporting telling you about that?
This is one of the really interesting parts of this election, and it sort of reaches a turning point that we've seen coming in Australian politics for some time, but really kind of comes to fruition in 2025. So for many, many years, the Liberal National Coalition was the natural party of big business. And it was seen as that by voters. But there's no doubt that this election marks a real turn away from that. Peter Dutton is threatening to break up major companies if they don't do the right thing by Australian consumers, a very unliberal way of handling Australia's economic policy. So, for instance, supermarkets have been threatened by the coalition with breakup if they do not properly pass on price reductions to consumers. And even potentially people like insurance companies have been threatened with action if they don't pass on reductions in prices to consumers. So this is a very different Liberal Party to the one we've seen in the past. This is, as they would describe it, the party of small business rather than the party of big business. Now, that being said, generally in Australia, big business would probably still prefer a Dutton government to an Albanese government, but there are other things which need to be taken into account as well. Many companies have started to bet on the energy transition to renewable energy, given the fact that when Labor came to power, it seemed they were going to be there for some time. If they were booted, that would require a big rethink, given Dutton has shown that he's not as keen on the renewable energy transition as Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party, thereby requiring a lot of chaos.
And by the sounds of all that, Ben, maybe the Labor-Liberal duopoly could also be busted after this election. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Rebecca Jones. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Ngunnawal people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.